Well, good afternoon, everybody. We've started the recording, and this session of Trainers Underground, we're going to talk about building a successful risk management framework program. Now, a risk management framework is something that the federal government is very much following and what they're required to do. So if you're in the Department of Defense or a public agency, risk management framework is something that's necessary for federal agencies to do. However, this whole session that we're talking about here really does apply to implementing any IT-based program in any organization. Anything related to cybersecurity, anything related to the risk management framework. So we're basically going to talk about, I have a program that I need to implement at my organization, coming kind of from the IT perspective, because what you'll find is if somebody in the business unit side is looking at doing security, they're going to have a different view and different than IT is usually going to come from. In addition to that, they may have access to things that IT doesn't have access to. So we'll talk about those things. So what we're looking at in this session here is talking about building a successful program. And it's not and how do you define success is something that has been very much debated, especially about how the federal government implements security. Prior to risk management framework coming out, when it was just called certification and accreditation, there was some concerns that it was a paper exercise and it wasn't being effective. In other words, it was not increasing security. And then some people would show some stats and say, yes, it is, but it's only bettering security on a very small scale. So I think more than being successful is you want to know that it's effective and efficient. And those are two things that I would always add into a successful program. If you're going to have a successful program, it's got to be effective. In other words, it's got to do what you want the security to do, and that is prevent incidents. But it's also got to be efficient. In other words, we don't want to waste money on stuff we don't need to be paying for. So first thing we've got to do anytime we want to set up a risk management framework, cybersecurity, or anything in IT, we need to build a business case for it. Oftentimes with IT folks, because they're not used to the business side of things, they will focus in on things like, we need to have a firewall because it's a part of regulations, or they'll give answers like that. But what we need to learn as IT folks and as security folks, when we want to sell something to management, is selling it in the way that they will understand it. So we're not selling a firewall to them. What we're wanting to explain to them and being able to articulate to them is there is a reason for this, there's a risk, and this is the way to mitigate that risk. So as a part, and when we explain that to them, yes, it's a part of our due diligence, which we would tell them, and we want to be accountable for what is necessary. And we want to explain to them that we're implementing risk management, and we want to show them that whatever we're going to do is going to be cost effective and not spending a whole lot of money on stuff that isn't necessary. So we'll have to have all that to have a big, strong business case. But in addition to that, what we want to be able to show is this is how it's going to help your business. So for example, let's say it's a firewall, or let's say it's antivirus. That's probably an easier example to use. If we're going to talk about selling antivirus to an organization, we go in there and we want to show them that it's a business enabler. It's not something that's going to restrict business, because typically what people think of passwords, and this has happened to me too once before, I would say, hey, we need to have passwords on. We moved from Windows 98 to Windows 2000, and it required that passwords were set up for the operating system for people to log in. And it was a requirement, and it was good practice back then anyways, just to have passwords. But I was in a firm that had no passwords, and they were used to not having passwords. Now all of a sudden they had to have passwords. And hand to God, this is exactly what happened. When I said, hey, we need to have passwords, one of the partners came to me and was very upset, and they told me, they said, you know what? Having to type in a password every day is not very efficient. It's not a good use of my time. The reason it's not is, he said, it takes me about 5 minutes, and it doesn't really take you 5 minutes, but he thought that he started the machine up, then he'd go get his coffee, he'd come back, and it was on the login screen. He had to log in, then he had to wait for it to finish loading. And yes, maybe Windows 2000 wasn't the fastest loading operating system in the world, but it didn't take 5 minutes. So he calculated that out. My billable rate is, $300 an hour, and then for 5 minutes it's X amount of dollars, and over the whole entire year that's X amount of dollars that I'm wasting. typing in a password. Hand to God, that's exactly what I was told to. But then what I had to explain to them, and what I learned early on, is that I had to show them that this isn't something that's impeding your progress. This is something that's protecting you, because if your computer went down for whatever reason, you would be out of work for a longer period of time. So I had to be able to articulate that to them in a business-friendly approach, I guess is what you have to say. So the same thing goes for like the risk management framework. Whenever you want to implement some type of new system or some type of new security within an organization, you want to make sure that it's understood that this is a business enabler. This is not something that is designed to prevent them from doing their jobs. As security professionals, sometimes we just look at things and say, oh, antivirus, we have to have antivirus, install it. And we don't think about what is the business reason for having this? What's the risk? What's the threat? How much is this going to impede their ability to do work? A good example of that in one of the federal agencies that I've done some work for, they actually had it set up so that every time you took a laptop out of the organization and you booted it up at home or at a hotel or at a conference or something like that, and when you first came back to within the agency's network, as soon as you logged in, it would then have to run a scan on your computer. Problem is the laptops they had were old and slow ones, in addition to having all the security features on it. So it would take 4 hours to scan the machine, and basically the machine was a brick for that 4 hours. You couldn't do anything with it. And worst of all, you couldn't cancel the scan. If you cancel the scan, it wouldn't let you get into anything on the network until it was finished. So it's network hygiene. Network hygiene is a really good thing if you're a security guy. You want to do that because you want to keep only clean computers getting inside of your network. The problem is, now you have staff sitting around for 4 hours unable to be productive. And so this is where we have to look at a risk-benefit approach, right? And this is not making the case for network hygiene. This is ruining the case for network hygiene, because you know what's going to say? The business managers are going to say, look, we don't need this. It's a waste of time. I got 200 people sitting around for 4 hours not being able to do anything because of this. So, employees then, they try to figure out ways around stuff. And this is something that we don't want them to do. So when we make our case, we want to make sure that the security that we're doing is actually going to be effective and efficient, and not... and again, our main goal is to make sure that they can do their mission, whatever the organization is. If you make widgets, you want to make sure that they're able to make widgets. If they're a federal government agency and their job is FISMA and they need to provide support in disasters, that's their mission. Our IT and our security need to help meet that mission. And so that's what we're looking at when we're talking about business case. Important part of this as well is whenever we set up a new program, especially if it's going to be a program, is setting goals. But even if you're doing implementation of a firewall, let's say, you're still going to have some type of goals that you need to set up. In other words, all right, I'm going to buy this. We need to first evaluate firewalls. We need to then find vendors that sell those firewalls. Then we want to, after we've done all that, we want to get bids. And then after we get bids, we want to evaluate the bids. And then we're going to have to figure out a time to set up the new firewall, do a cutover from, do some testing, and then do a cutover for the new firewall. So look, I haven't even got through half of it. We're talking about all of these things that you have to do. And so you have to set goals for this and plan everything out, so to speak. So, and what I just said is basically typical project management skills. So if you've ever looked at some of the project management or taken a class on project management, there's some certifications out there. There's the PMP, the project manager from the Project Management Institute, and then there's other things like Project Plus, and that's from CompTIA, and that's specifically to IT project management. Either way, both of them are great. Probably the PMP is probably a little bit more universal because you could apply that outside of IT. But it does have like little areas where that you can focus in on a particular type of, what do they call it, industry vertical or something like that. So when we set these goals, we want to make sure that our goals are realistic, right? We have to know what we're trying to accomplish and know that it can be accomplished. We also want to make sure that it's going to be comprehensive. In other words, if we are implementing something like a firewall, or we're setting up something like the risk management framework within an organization, we want to make sure that we're covering everything that needs to be covered. And that's what we talk about comprehensive. We want to make sure also that this is an integrated approach, because when we look at security, especially security and risk management framework, everybody needs to be a part of it. And this is probably the hardest part for everybody to get a handle. It's not an IT function. It's the whole organization's function to reduce risk in the IT infrastructure. Um, Particularly end users, because end users have to follow all these things, right? All the rules and regulations and not disable controls and all that kind of stuff. So it's integrated in that they have to be a part of this. And obviously, if they're going to be a part of this, their managers and direct reports have to also be a part of this. And you want to make sure that they're integrated in the approach. And we'll talk more about that in future sessions here. But we want to make sure that whatever our goal setting, they're going to be achievable, that they can be done in the period of time that we say, that we have the man hours to do it. I don't know how many times what is it? 80% of IT projects fail because they never get finished. 80% of them. I think it was a Gardner research, and I don't know if there's a newer research that says something else, but there is research out there that shows most IT projects are fail. Well, cybersecurity ones also fall right into that category, where a number of them don't achieve the end goal that they set out to do. So in addition to that, you want to make sure that it's effective, that you don't implement risk management framework, which is a cybersecurity framework to protect your system, if it's not going to protect your system, right? So effectiveness is important with that. You want to make sure management supports it. This is the most important aspect of the entire risk management framework, is management support. They have to buy in on it. In fact, it's highly some organizations will call them a champion. You have to get a champion at the C level of an organization, somebody who sits at the table, the big table, who is vested in this, who wants to see this happen. They want to see this work, and they want to see it go, and they have sufficient authority within the organization that if they say that this is an important aspect for our organization, that it sets a tone at the top, and that the employees and the middle managers and all those people want to follow it as well. So this is the most important thing. It's highly, well, and it depends upon the culture of the organization too. So all of that kind of plays a factor into this. So if you are new into an organization trying to set up the risk management framework, or if I have been many times the consultant going in and trying to set stuff up, if you don't understand what the organization's management and culture, the personality of the organization is, what they think about security, you may fail, because you need to know what it is so that you know what you're dealing with, so you know how to approach it. Because if they don't value security and they don't value anything like that, it's going to be a very short-lived project. And what we want to make sure is that this is an enduring project. In other words, it's something that goes on, because the risk management framework is a life cycle approach. So you're constantly doing stuff. Security is not like a goal. It's like a posture or stance that you have to maintain. Therefore, it's more like a process, but it's an ongoing process. So, of course, with project management, excuse me, with any project management, you're going to set up tasks and milestones. And again, typical project management skills we're talking about here. And basically, just to give you just a little bit so that you understand a little bit about project management, any project that you have will have multiple stages. And in those stages, there'll be tasks and milestones that need to be done. Generally, a milestone is just kind of what it sounds like, and probably what you use in normal vernacular when you say milestone, and that is there is a point during this project where you've accomplished some goal. Now, there'll be multiple tasks that lead up to that milestone. So tasks are usually smaller units of activity, where the milestones is the goal that you were trying to reach. And then you may have multiple stages of those, and each stage may have its own milestone that ends it. And basically, tasks are made up of those small things that usually have some type of period of time that they need to be done with. And this is a way simplified version of project management. Obviously, there's whole 40-hour courses out there on it, so don't think that I'm trying to give you the whole enchilada now. What I'm just trying to make sure is that you understand that project management is a part of any cybersecurity program that you're going to implement, especially the risk management framework, if that is what you're looking at doing. Now, somebody, again, needs to oversee this, the program execution, to make sure that it happens. I've gone in as a consultant many times in a lot of organizations, and I've seen where management either if they don't care or they don't put enough pressure on the people to get their tasks done or make sure that the program is continually moving forward, that it just doesn't get done. It ends up dying a slow death. Because if anytime that you come to somebody and say, hey, here's a new risk management framework thing that we want to do, most of your employees are like, oh, I got all this other work that I got to do. Now you want to add something else onto it. And so a lot of times what will happen is they will be kind of a little bit rejecting the process of getting into it. So it's usually really good to have some form of metrics involved. And that's one of the big points of risk management framework on the continuing monitoring side, is to have some type of metrics, a dashboard that shows what the progress of everything is. Now, if you've done project management before, usually you track all the process and who's completed with what tasks and where you are at the milestone, how many hours have been applied to the project and all that stuff. Use something like Microsoft Project Server or something like that. You're using a software like that that's tracking all of this stuff. You want to be able to do that so that you can see that you're moving forward in progress, and that becomes a very important aspect with any cybersecurity or risk management framework that you're implementing. You want to track it and make sure it's done. Management needs to make sure they enforce whatever rules they are. In addition to that, you may even set up within an organization, if it's a larger organization, a committee. It's an oversight committee that kind of help the process. You don't have to have a committee. You could have the champion that I kind of talked about too. Either one of those can do it. Both have their benefits. Not a requirement for the risk management framework, but something that can really help you get the process. Because if you're the one, let's say you're the IT guy, and you're trying to implement this by yourself, it's usually an uphill battle. So you want to enlist support for yourself. And if you can get a champion or a committee that will oversee the process, that will help greatly with it. In addition to this, you want to make sure that this program is going to be visible to management and end users and everybody that has a vested interest in the organization meeting whatever its mission is. Without that management support, people are not going to fulfill their obligations. We call that tone at the top. Whatever management says, if your boss thinks that passwords are stupid and unimportant, his staff will probably think passwords are stupid and unimportant as well. So what you want to make sure is that management gets it, they understand their obligations, that they're supportive of it, and that they're not seen as trying to sidestep controls or complaining about it, because once they start doing it, then it sets the tone and sometimes it's within a certain silo of an organization, and then that silo then gets this bad implementation or bad vibe or whatever you want to call it of the project, and it ends up just slowing down the project process. So it's going to end up hurting you in the end. So you want to make sure they're all on the right side of it. So who can help maintain the visibility? A lot of organizations will have a chief information security officer. So this gives somebody usually at the C level of management the ability to sit at the big table and to say security is an important thing. Even if he's not at the big table all the time, but that he has access to the big table is also a good thing. Because I've known a lot of organizations where the CISO actually reported to the CIO, which there's some good and bad points to that, and we'll talk about that in a future session, because there's a little bit of separation you want to have between the CIO and the CISO, or whoever's in charge of security, in addition to making sure that that you're also, because if you also have internal audit or something like that, you want to make sure that they're removed from the process as well. So they should not report to the CIO. They should actually report directly to whoever the board is, or if you're a local government, like a council or board of directors, because you don't want them to report to the CIO, because they're going to report based upon what they found that the CIO has been doing. So then there's oversight there. So if you have an internal audit function, maybe the CISO being a part of the reporting to the CIO is a good thing. If you don't have that, you might want to separate that. You don't have to remember that now. We'll talk about that in a later session, and it'll make more sense probably. So anytime you want to implement anything new, a project, risk management framework, cybersecurity, anything, you're going to need some resources to do it. And so you need to be aware that you need to have these resources, and you're going to have to plan out what those resources are so that you can make sure that you have them. So the first thing, obviously, is money, funds, right? You have to have a budget for it. And generally, everything kind of revolves around money, because money is what you have to pay the people, which is the next thing you need. You need man hours. Man hours is actually a dollar cost, but it's also making sure that you have skilled people that can do whatever it is that you need to get done. And then you always you need time, right? Time's another thing you need, and time is just a matter of how many is man hours, really, is what it is. So it's just a part of the HR thing. But depending upon how many people you have, depends upon how many man hours you can get done within a week. So if you need to have a certain task done within a week and it takes 80 man hours and you only have one person, it means you're going to need another person, right? So you just have to calculate all that, and all that then means more money. And then you're probably going to need some type of tools or resources or materials for them to do whatever it is that they're going to do. So those usually cost money as well. And so that might be new technology that you need. That may be some training that people need to have. That may be some tools that you need to get as well. Maybe you have to do some operations and set up some processes and policies and stuff like that. That's going to cost some money as well. But there's going to be some resources that you might need. In addition to that, you may need outside assistance. And this is where it becomes really important. If you have a deficit within your organization, in other words, your people don't have a good grasp of the risk management framework or the whatever cybersecurity thing that you're implementing, you may need to make sure that you get somebody who understands that has the expertise of implementing that in your type of organization. So if you're local government, you want to make sure that you get somebody that can implement firewalls in a local government if that's what you're doing. If you're at the federal government level and you're implementing the risk management framework, you want to make sure that you have somebody that understands what the risk management framework is from NIST and how other agencies are implementing it that can help you implement it within yours. Now, for the most part, all the federal government agencies have all implemented the risk management framework, except for the DoD and NSA and CIA and those folks, because they have their own separate systems. They're eventually going to be morphing their systems into a risk management framework based on NIST, but with some modifications to meet their needs. But the rest of them already have it in place. So how does this apply to them? Well, again, this is a cycle and it's an ongoing process. So the risk management framework they're in the ongoing process of it. They still need all these things to maintain the program going forward. And again, I can't stress enough, make sure that we have realistic requirements and realistic goals. We have to be real about the risk that's out there. This could happen to us. This is what we need to do to fix it. We don't have the money to do it. So what does that mean? Well, we got to push that back up. Management needs to know that we don't have the money or the skills or the manpower or whatever deficit we have for us to meet our goals. This becomes really important because we're later on when we talk about roles and responsibilities, which will be our next session after this. All the roles and responsibilities that are a part of this process, there's responsibilities in there. And that means management needs to know if they've been informed that that IT staff doesn't have the necessary training to implement the controls as necessary in an effective and efficient manner and all that stuff. They're kind of on the hook to make sure that they figure out how to get the budget to make sure that those people are trained and have the resources they need to implement their thing. If they don't have it, they won't be able to implement the controls. And that becomes in itself its own risk, right? So now you're at a higher risk because of that. So developing guidance. So anytime you're going to set up a new program, especially if it's going to be a program, you want to document what the program is. You want to document how it's going to be implemented. And you're going to have different things like policy, standards, guidelines, procedures, all of that kind of operations stuff that needs to be implemented. That usually needs to be implemented first, right? So you need to have a process for dealing with overruns in the project, dealing with how you're going to deal with risk. All of that becomes an important part of the risk management framework. So you're going to need to make sure it has it. And of course, all those documents and guidelines, that's to assist employees and staff in implementing something. So this is management's official communication to folks, their employees or their staff, as to how things are supposed to be done. And policies should be taken by staff as non-negotiable. It should be done. And if a policy needs to be sufficiently flexible in order for giving people the ability to do things. It should be written up in the policy what people are able to do. For example, I was reading, I forgot what the name of the book was, a manager, I don't know, it's one of those business management books, and the manager of some retail store said that in his policy was this: if an employee can fix a problem fix a problem for under $200 from a customer that's having a whatever the problem is, right? If the customer satisfaction or something like that and it's bad, if they want to get something fixed and it's less than $200, he's giving them permission to deal with it. So what am I trying to say here? You can write a policy that gives them the flexibility to fix things within a certain parameters. And it doesn't have to be dollars, amounts, or anything like that. You can say IT managers are allowed to accept X amount of risk or something like that, or make decisions based upon this, or spend X amount of dollars on security technologies per year. Whatever that is, that can be put in there. So having a policy doesn't mean that it's rigid and that you can't do anything other than what the policy says. The policy can be written such that it can be flexibly implemented, and probably should be. And again, the whole idea is to meet organizational business needs. And one part of this, actually, we'll talk about documentation later, but just really quickly, it should be precise, clear, and brief. You don't want to have people having to look through 50 pages of documentation for them to find out how they're supposed to do their job. It should be very quick, so they look it up, say, oh, how am I supposed to process this? Here it is. Here's the 3 steps. They should be able to quickly find it. So making sure it's online, making sure it's written at an 8th grade level. I know a lot of people complain about that, say, well, why does it have to be written at an 8th grade level? Well, when you have a whole set of employees, and some of those employees, English isn't their first language, making sure that you write it at 8th grade level is like the common denominator that the general public, the majority of the general public would understand something written at an 8th grade level. And so when you write your policies and procedures and all that stuff, you want to make sure it's written at that level. And policies not so much, but procedures definitely, putting in graphics, screenshots of how to set up a server, whatever. Those types of things are really useful. Procedures, even if doing bullet points, step 1, step 2, step 3. For anyone that's a trainer, you'll know what this one means. Write it like you're writing a lab manual, right? You know, step 1, step 2, step 3. So it explains everything. But then you also want to make sure that and you can add this in, but you want to make sure that however you position it on the page, that it doesn't interfere with people seeing step 1, step 2, step 3. You can then go into, say, step 1, more information about step 1, and then it can explain the rationale as to why step 1 is this way and where exceptions may exist. But you don't want to put that into the body of it, because it distracts people from going through step 1 through 4, and they're trying to finish whatever the process is. So you want it brief and clear, and if you need extra explanations, if it's an HTML page, you can always make a link, and it can go into the explanation of step 1. So you want to keep it clear, but that they can expand it into further information. Here's an example of an old policy that I found online, but anyways, it's a sample certification and accreditation policy, which is just basically saying this system has to follow the risk management framework process. This is an old one because it says certification and accreditation lifecycle, but it's the same thing as the risk management. It's not the same thing as the risk management framework, but it's the predecessor to the risk management framework. That's the way to say it. And as I go through the 40 hours of the risk management framework, you're going to get tired of me talking about life cycles, but here's one of the first ones we're going to talk about. Everything has a life cycle. I envision this like like a watch. If you take off the back of an old-fashioned watch that has all the little cogs and the little sprockets in there, just think of one big sprocket. That's the risk management framework. All these little sprockets all around it that are spinning off of it. And everything's going to have its own life cycle. So the first life cycle we're going to talk about, because the first thing we're talking about is documentation. Well, the first thing we're going to talk about is a life cycle for the documentation. So your guidance documentation or your policies and procedures, they're going to have, and I just have a 4-phased approach here. There's going to be a process where you do your development. That's the first step. So let me highlight that so that you can see it. I'll put a green check on it right there so you can see where it's at. Development's the first step. So you need to determine what guidance documentation do I need. So and that's when you're going to start figuring out what you need. You're going to create it. Somebody's going to review it, and then it's going to be approved. So it hasn't been released to anybody yet by this point in time. Up until this point in time, you've determined what your needs are. You've created it. You've reviewed it. Whoever in management needed to approve it, approved it. Then you're going to move on to the implementation phase, which is over here. And this is the second phase. That's where you're going to communicate this. You're going to put it up on the server. You're going to print it out and put it in binders, whatever, however you do it. And then you're going to implement it. You're going to communicate it to the staff so staff understands. You may have to do some type of training for it as well. You're going to then verify that people have gotten the notification for it, that it's been put up on the server, and people have access to it, and all that stuff. Next thing you're going to do is the maintenance phase, which is down here. And this is where you do awareness, and this is where you keep people informed and you remind people periodically, hey, we have this process, just so that you don't forget that this is how we do things. And you're going to monitor it. So in other words, part of the monitoring is this guideline or this policy or this procedure. And it's a really good idea if you have an intranet site and you have all your policies and procedures there, that you have a button on each page that says report a problem on this page. And empower employees to, if they look at a policy or procedure and something looks wrong on it, or the steps don't follow the way they should, or the policy is outdated for whatever reason, allow them to report it. And then if they report it and they say, hey, something's wrong with this, this procedure doesn't work anymore because after we implemented Service Pack 2, that function goes away, and so we can't follow the instructions as written. They could then implement that and then go back to the development stage, and somebody looks at that and says, yes, you know what, that's right, this one needs to be updated. That's their need. They assess their need. They figure out what they need to do to fix it to get to the same ends that they needed to. Then they create the new document, new review, new approval, new implementation, and then you're back to the maintenance phase on a new one. So you want to make sure that you have some type of feedback that it's not working. Because if you make the document and you're not the person that uses it on a day-to-day basis, maybe a server admin is, if they're not able to communicate back to you some way, they probably won't, and then they'll just stop using the documentation because the documentation's out of date. And we don't want them to do that, and later on we'll explain why that's important that they follow procedures on a regular basis. So that's part of the monitoring. Then part of enforcement is to make sure that they're following it, that we're making sure that staff is following the procedures that they have. If they don't, you do training for them to explain to them how they're supposed to follow it. Spot checking it. And, if something fails, you go back and you look to see why it failed. Oh, it failed because the server admin didn't follow the instructions as written. If he did, this wouldn't happen. And then eventually documentation gets old and needs to be recycled and got out of there, and there's a disposal phase of it. And that, we call that maybe retirement, but you get rid of it. It's no longer useful. You dispose of it. Or it's no longer necessary, but you still need to do that process. That technology it relied upon is no longer there. So we now have to go back to the development phase and start a whole new one. So the last phase, disposal, just about getting rid of the documentation eventually. And this follows just a general life cycle, just like any other life cycle that you're going to see throughout this entire course as we go through, because there's plenty more that we talk about. Some caution on the guidance whenever you do this. Again, we have to remember that too many rules can limit the latitude and innovation that may be needed by your organization. Each organization is going to be different. So you want to make sure that when you set that up, that it's set up in such a way that it caters to the needs of the organization and also to the style that the organization is. That becomes an important part of it. Again, like I've said, if your guidance is like this graphic here where it's like just a stack of paper and you say, here's how to set up a new server, is anybody going to read that? I mean, no. I've seen so many of those things that just end up sitting on somebody's bookshelf just gaining dust. So especially when someone sees something like this. Now, if you put this all in little chunks, like one-page chunks on an intranet site that people can search things for, your IT staff are far more likely to use it. Also, they're far more likely to use it if it's kept up to date. So that's an important aspect about whatever you're going to use for documentation. And if you have too many rules, obviously that will limit your agility. So the ability to move and to respond to the market or respond to risk, you reduce your agility if you make things too rigid. So that's an important process, because that in and of itself becomes another risk, right? You have all these risks out there, risks of attacks or something like that. If you go back in time and talk about SQL injection errors, before SQL injection was a big thing and was really known, if you wrote your documentation, when you set up a new SQL server, you will do X, Y, and Z, and you didn't give the ability to update the documentation as necessary when new risks came in, and you didn't implement saying, oh, SQL injection is a new risk that you need to address in this way, and the old way of doing the guidance actually leaves us exposed. Don't do that anymore. If you limited their agility and you didn't update the documentation fast enough, then all of a sudden you now have a new risk. And as the increase in hackers using SQL injection increases, the likelihood that your organization would get hit increases. And if you're not being agile and you're not allowing people to change, then what ends up happening is your risk goes up, but you're not doing anything about it. So you want to make sure you don't limit yourself. And they should be easy to access, and intranet site's a great idea, and system administrators need to know that they use them on a regular basis. But whatever the process is, because not everything is going to be an IT process, they need to follow. So HR has processes they need to follow about hiring of employees and terminating employees, and they have to do all that stuff as well. So program integration. Again, risk management framework or the certification and accreditation, whatever that program is, it should be integrated with all the other organization programs and processes and activities. Finance already has, and it should already have, an inventory process for all the assets of the organization. Why are we creating another inventory system to track, for cybersecurity, all the IT computer systems? Why do we have two inventories? Why not have one? And all right, so there's a lot to that, but what we're trying to do is make sure that we're not doubling our effort unnecessarily. If a list already exists, can we leverage it? And some people say, well, no, because finance will, once something's completely depreciated, they get rid of it, or it goes off their books. Well, it goes off their books, but if you put it into a database, an inventory database, there can be a check mark that says removed from finance's view, and finance doesn't see it anymore because it's fully depreciated, but it leaves it in the IT view so that the IT people still know, oh, yeah, there's that server that's still over in the corner in that other room that we forgot about. Because most of the time that people get hacked, it's that server that's over in the corner room that everybody forgot about because it's not being patched, nobody's doing anything with it. So integrating those two things together can be very helpful. Integrating human resources, because they're doing background checks before you hire people and implement them on the systems. Another good example is guard service for physical security. So if you have physical security that's patrolling the building, perimeter, campus, whatever, you want to make sure that that security is a part of the security that's also protecting the IT system. So that's another area where there's going to be some coverage as well. So when you look at all this stuff, and again, end users have to follow all these things, right? Because there's going to be rules about how they can access systems and when they can access systems and changing passwords. So they're a part of it. Making sure that it's all interconnected and that we're working. And the idea why we have bread on this slide, because everybody's always asking, why is there bread on this slide? Because you want it baked in. Yeah, you can't tack it on the outside afterwards. Security has to be baked into the process from the beginning to the end. So for example, to make sure that new systems, when they come into the organization, before they're implemented and set up and put into production, to make sure risk management has been done with it as a part of the procurement process. In other words, someone goes out to purchase something and they set up the purchase order. As soon as that is set up, someone set up a purchase order, it should then flag the IT department. A new IT asset has been ordered. This is what it is, and this is when it's going to be coming in. And then it should also flag for the security process, so that the security process can then start and say, okay, this new product's coming in, laptop, whatever, we need to implement the following security. Here's the configuration or gold standard that needs to be applied to it, so that when it arrives on the loading dock, and as soon as someone signed off that it's appropriate and it's there, and sign off that the packing slip matches, what's inside the box and all that stuff. Once that's been done, then the process, it should not be plugged into the wall and just turned on and happy-go-lucky. No, it should then go into the security process to make sure that it's configured appropriately before it enters the network, etc. So in order to catch that, if you have that set up as a part of the procurement process, security or IT is going to know long before the item even arrives at the organization. So integrating those things, make sure there's no holes in our process. So points of contact. So when you do the risk management framework, there's going to be a lot of people involved. There's going to be key players, obviously Chief Information Security Officer of whatever organization, or whoever's filling that role, because that role may be a different name within other organizations. I was looking at some organization, I forgot what it was, and the CEO was called, or I don't even know if it was the CEO, to tell you the truth, but he was called the Chief Happiness Officer. And I'm like, and Chief Dreaming Officer or something, weird names like that. And I'm like, okay, so what does that mean that those people are, right? What you call it's not really important. We're going to use the standard definitions that they use in the risk management framework. And in the next session, when we talk about some of these roles, we're going to default with what NIST uses so that we're on the same page for the risk management framework. But I'm also going to throw in what the DoD uses for it, because they have the same kind of roles, but then they have different names for the same people. Anyways, so we'll talk about what those roles are. But it's important that whoever's in part of this, whoever's the top dog as far as the security goes within the organization, you want to make sure you have that point of contact for it. Other key people are going to be system owners, and we'll talk about who those are. Any work groups, any committees, any IT administrators, IT managers, all those people are going to be a part of. They're going to be key contacts for this. Other areas of knowledge for organizations, especially if you're a consultant, you got to know about this stuff, is what the hierarchy is, what the management is, what the style of management is, what stage they're in. Is this an initiative that they're starting? Is it something that everybody's into, or is it something that only one person really wants to fight for, and for whatever reason they got a budget but nobody's really committed to it? How does operations work within the organization? So all those things become areas of the organization. Even if you're already in the organization, if you're not familiar with all that, you're going to need to get familiar with it, because again, security is going to go across the whole entire organization. There's very few places within any organization that IT does not touch these days. Measuring progress, we talked a little bit about this. You need to have some type of means to measure the effectiveness of the program as it gets implemented and as it works. So the federal government's spending a lot of money doing a lot of dashboards to kind of figure out ways, like checking controls on a regular basis to report that those controls are in place and working as intended and produce the desired outcome. But in addition to that, also what tasks that need to be continuously done. For example, a great thing to have is a maintenance calendar for IT, but there's also maintenance for everybody else. So don't just limit it to IT. There's maintenance things that HR needs to do, and there's maintenance things that operations people need to do, and all kinds of other stuff. So it's not just IT, but since we're primarily talking about IT, let's just talk about that. For example, there's time-sensitive tasks that need to be done on a regular basis, like checking audit logs. That should be done X amount of time, after so many days of activity or whatever it is, or as needed. Typically, they throw the as needed on as an example, like, we check the audit logs once a month, unless there's a reason because of something happened that we need to check it earlier, right? So as needed, that's where that comes in. But then you usually have some. Now, like for an example, off the topic of the risk management framework, but like PCI, they actually have some very tight intervals for things. You have to do this on a monthly basis. You have to do this on a quarterly basis. You have to do this on an annual basis. And they have a lot of that written out. Risk management framework, on the other hand, if you go through the documentation, which would be NIST Special Publication 853, Revision 4 is the newest one. If you look at that, in each control, not in each control, but in controls that have something like review the audit logs, it'll say review the audit logs, and it'll say brackets on a organizational defined period, end bracket, da-da-da-da-da. So it's basically saying that the organization has to define how often that they want the audit logs checked, right? So it doesn't prescribe for you, you have to do it every 30 days. It says you need to determine it. And how do you determine it? Based upon risk, right? So you have to do a risk assessment. It doesn't have to be a full risk assessment. It can be a little mini risk assessment as to how often you should check your audit logs, and you should adjust that over time as necessary. Whereas if you have things like PCI, you don't have any options on it. A lot of those are hard set, and you do this every month, you do this weekly, you do this daily. I mean, they have some very strict guidelines on it, and you're not compliant if you're not doing those things, right? If it says daily, you're supposed to check audit logs, which I believe is what PCI says. If you're not doing it daily, you're not compliant, and not being compliant is a bad thing for PCI, because if you get hacked and you're not compliant, then you're fully liable for all losses. If you're completely compliant, then you get it in the safe harbor where your organization is not liable for it. So that becomes really important. So measuring that progress and making sure that you're on task is really important when it comes, because now it's talking money, right? Your organization can end up losing some money out of that. So scope, time, budget, all that stuff are really important for that. Tracking your activities. I always think of it like you're driving down the road. You need to know how much gas you have. You need to know how far you're going. You need to know where you're going, so that you can determine when you need to get gas and the route you need to take, and if you have to be there by a certain time, where you're going to be there. That's all the same stuff. So when you're tracking program activities, it's like the same type of thing. You got to keep your eyes on the road, right? You got to know where you are. You got to determine, and I learned this really when I learned how to drive a motorcycle, because they always say you have to always scan the road, look as far ahead as possible, so you can determine any potential hazards. So we call that forecasting, right? You're doing risk management, saying what could possibly happen. Discern any outside influences, like what are other projects running, and what's the budget looking like for next year. Keep people informed. That's reporting up to them. That's looking at your gauges in your car or on your motorcycle, right? And you have to know what you have, like your gas gauge, right? So you have to do all that kind of stuff. And when you determine potential hazards, you have to figure out what you're going to do to address those and avoid them. So if you're doing compliance in risk management framework, if you're in the federal government, it does have a compliance aspect. In other words, you have to report all the controls you don't have in place. And you have to do that on what's called a plan of actions and milestones, or a POANM, or POAM. Some people call it POAM. And that is just basically a list of, we need a firewall. It's going to cost about $5,000, and we hope to have it implemented by next year. That's what the plan of action milestone is, a list of all of that. Each entity within the federal government, each entity within an agency within the federal government will have their own list, and each system will have its own list. And then the agency as a whole will take all those lists and consolidate them into one big, huge, giant list, and then they're supposed to report those to the Department of Homeland Security for them to look at, and then also to Congress for budgeting purposes. So it's a list of all the things that need to be done. Now, if you're not the federal government in that process, but you still need to keep track of this. And you don't have to call it a plan of action milestone. Some people call it the remediation list. You just need to make a list of all the things that need to get done. And the reason why we make a list is so that it doesn't get forgotten, right? So you're monitoring the progress. And the federal government, actually, they have it. They want to look for, you said you need a firewall and you're going to have it by next April. They want to know that you're going to have it fixed within a year. And if you're not going to have it fixed within a year, you can ask for an extension. But after that, then they want to know why it wasn't implemented. And so that means each agency has to commit budget to make sure that these things get done. If you're not the federal government and you don't have that mandate behind you about the budget, still keeping the list of remediation items and then reporting that list on an ongoing basis. If you let's say you were a city, reporting that to council annually, just saying, every December I'm going to report to you, and this is what we're going to tell you is what we still need. That way they understand, and the budgeting people understand, what IT needs these things, otherwise they're not doing what they should be for security. And so sometimes if you're testing controls and you find out they're not in place, then it's going to possibly trigger a recertification. A new vulnerability may do that. You may start the risk management framework cycle over again with the 6 steps that we'll talk about coming up. You may need to provide assistance and advice. You may need to go to external professionals. You may need to go to other organizations. Like there's a lot of trade organizations out there that can help, like ISSA, the Information System Security Association, places like that where you can go. I know here in California, if you're in a local government, like a city government, there's a thing called MESAC, and then they can kind of help with that. You go to those other professional organizations, and they may have help, and they may not either. It just depends, because cybersecurity may be something you need to look into other places for. But you want to make sure that you're getting help and that you're kind of doing things like other people are doing them, right? Maybe even talk to your auditors or something like that. Responding to change. Things are going to change, and you need to address them. When I was in the Marines, one of the things we always talked about is the ability to adapt and overcome. So if the battlefield changes, that doesn't mean that our goal changes. Well, our goal may change, but our overall goal of winning whatever it is that we need to win is a part of that. And so you want to make sure that we're able to, as necessary, have access to whatever we need to have access to, or change because of the circumstances change. And the other question we have to ask is the change material, because sometimes what I mean by material is it significant. If it's an insignificant change, then, well, who cares? It's not that big of a deal. If it's a significant risk or a significant change in risk or process or something like that, then we need to, relook at things. So, like a new vulnerability, well, if it's a new vulnerability in, like, let's say Windows, and everybody has Windows, and it's just a minor vulnerability, then it's probably just something that's going to be handled by patch management. No need to make a big federal case out of it, right? But what about new risks that are brought about because you changed something? You've taken Windows out and you put Linux in. Now there's all these new risks. Well, now you need to address those, and that means we have to start all over again. What if a control fails? Your firewall fails. Well, well, then we need to address that, right? Let's say you get a virus and you had antivirus installed. Why did it not catch it? And so you have to go in and check those things. And sometimes it happens, and this has happened to us even within our own organization, where we've noticed that over time, a certain antivirus vendor that we were using was not catching as many viruses, and one year we got one, and the next year we got two, and the next year it seemed like we got three or four. And I just said, we need to look at another one, because we just had an uptick, and it's not been going down, it's just been going up. We looked at another one, we found another one, implemented it, and we found that it went back down. So we have to look at those things over time. And then auditing findings, if you have controls that are missing, figure out how to get them back in place. The key to all of this is making sure that the program, there's awareness within the organization, that there's training and education for everybody. And everybody's training and education is going to be different. IT people need different training than end users. And everybody and managers need different training than the other folks. And it has to be tailored to their position and what they're doing. When I worked out at NASA for a couple of years as a contractor, one of the things that I thought that they did really, really well is for the risk management framework, which actually was the certification accreditation program at the time when I was there, they had classes, they were all online classes, that were set for IT administrators or system administrators, for the information system security officer, for the authorization profession, person. And they had different training for each one of them, and that training was, you're this position, this is the role that you play, this is what you need to do, this is why you're doing what you're doing, and this is the process and why you're a part of this whole process. Here's the whole process, here's your part in that process, and why your part's important. And I thought that was really good, because I went to other organizations, other federal government agencies, and they didn't have it. They just said, here's the risk management framework, and we're going to give you 40 hours of training. Everybody didn't need 40 hours of training. The authorization official does not need 40 hours of training to understand what his part is. He can get it done in an hour. And he's probably a busy person, or she's a busy person, so you don't want to burden them with a 40-hour class. You want to just give them the 1 hour consolidated thing. Hey, if you're an authorizing official, this is what you need to know. Right? So, and you want to track that. You want to make sure that everybody goes through it, because end users should do this annually. That's a part of this as well. And their end users, for end users, it's not what the whole risk management framework is. It's things like don't click on attachments, don't turn off your firewall, that kind of stuff, right? Use of expert systems. Expert systems are like anything that's got some type of artificial intelligence or that type of thing. But usually there's tracking systems related to this, audit log management systems, dashboards, IPS systems can help out with that as well. So there's all those types of systems that you can use in the program and as controls within the risk management framework. Waivers and exceptions to policies. So it becomes really important that whenever you set up a policy or a procedure that has to be done, there's going to be things that you never foreseen that pop up because you didn't know about this or you didn't know about that. So how are you going to deal with waivers and exceptions? So in the policy, there should be in all policies really should have this, unless there is absolutely no way to have a waiver and exception, because all policies are trying to establish a goal, whatever the goal is. If you have a policy for turning in timesheets or whatever, the goal is why do you have this policy about turning in timesheets? Well, it's so that payroll can get the information, so payroll can cut checks and da. And why is this important? Well, because by this date, if it's not done, then payroll can't cut your check by the time that you need to get paid. And there's a federal law that says you have to be paid by X amount of date from when you worked or whatever it is. And so in order to do this, this has to be done by this date. So if you understand why the policy exists, then you can talk about waivers and exceptions. Okay, so the waivers and exceptions to this policy, then you would say, okay, who's going to consider, how are you going to consider it? Well, the first thing is you have to know what the end goal is and why you did it this way, right? So you have to understand that. So in order to consider something to be a waiver, you have to understand what the end goal for this process was. You have to determine who can make the decision. So is it going to be a manager, department head, something like that? Is it possible to make a decision in a timely manner? Because sometimes there's a time issue, like on the payroll issue. How is a decision going to be documented? And this becomes an important thing, because if you have a waiver and exception, you need to log that you've made this exception, whatever it is. Because if you have an auditor or somebody come in and say, hey, you normally do this, why did it not happen this time? So somebody needs to explain, this happened, this person was out sick, couldn't turn in the timesheet, this is why it didn't get done. Except for you should probably already have a process in place if somebody was out sick and missed something. But anyways, if there was some other thing that was done, you would have it would be explained, written up, and then stored somewhere, so that if somebody ever asked, you can always go back to it. If it's related to an IT function, let's stop thinking about the payroll thing, but it's an IT thing. Whoever the system owner is, do they accept the risk that this waiver or exception is going to introduce to the system? Right? So they need to do it. And it's important to remember that the risk management framework itself is not supposed to be a paper exercise. So we're not just trying to shuffle paper around here and say we're doing all this stuff. It's supposed to be based upon risk. So we're making decisions about how to implement controls, how to make waivers and exceptions to those controls if necessary, based on risk. So risk management helps the organization meet those goals of being risk-based. And again, waivers should be based upon the business need as well. So again, we want to be a business enabler, not something that is holding business back. So summary of what we've talked about today. We want to make sure that we can make a good, strong business case for the risk management framework or any cybersecurity program that we're talking about. We want to make sure when we set the program up that we establish tasks, milestones, and goals that we want to make sure get met. We want to make sure that we have the resources necessary for it. We want to make sure that this program is integrated throughout our organization. There may be phases related to that as well. Make sure that we have all the people and all the important people that are a part of the process. We make sure that we know who they all are and that they're all on the same page and that they set the tone at the top. We want to make sure that we can measure and track the results of what we've done. We want to make sure then we also take our human resources and make sure that they have the education, training, and awareness that they need to implement it in the first place and maintain it going forward. And then again, at the very end, there may be exceptions and waivers. How are those going to be handled? That should be a documented process, and any waivers and exceptions should be documented somehow and implemented in some type of storage somewhere. So with that, I open it up for questions. If anybody has any questions, by the way, if you want to look for upcoming sessions, you can go to Trainers Underground. The website's finally working. So if you go to trainersunderground.com, you can see a list of the trainers who have agreed to do some sessions here in the future. In addition to, if you click on the blog, you can see the past sessions. So if you missed last week's session, the introduction to the risk management framework, you can go back there. And if you want to look and sign up for new sessions, you can go to that website and it'll take you to a link, or you can go to trainersunderground.eventbrite.com. Also, if you want to view past sessions, you can see them on YouTube, or you can also get them from the trainersunderground.com. So with that, is there any questions? I see somebody typing something. You can also unmute yourself and talk if you have any questions related to it. Don't tell me I answered every question. Oh, so the question is, the question that came in was, in my organization as the IT manager, I'm sort of the de facto CISO. Yes, you probably are. But I report to the finance director. Is that an issue? If so, how should it be handled? Because of my hardware issues, I can't, oh, sorry, don't have to read that part. So good point. If you are the IT manager, so you don't have no separation between IT standard functions and the security functions, that's fine. Usually what then the risk management framework would require somewhere along the line is that an independent third party would come in and assess those controls. The assessment of those controls is to validate for anybody else within the organization that IT is doing what they need to do. So that's a part of the independent audit process or assessment processes we'll talk about in a future session. Now, for the practicality, organizationally structured wise, reporting to the finance director, it kind of depends. And because I know a little bit about your situation, I'm kind of I'm trying not to say, hey, do it this way, and then knowing that that may not necessarily be the best way for your situation. But in organizations, typically what I would recommend is that the IT be sufficiently separate from any other line of business. So other departments. It should kind of be its own department. And in a situation, if you're in a local government, reporting directly to city manager or directly to the council if that was a thing, but usually directly to, and not directly to council, usually to a committee of the council. If you had a large enough council where you had a tech committee or something related to it that you report to. The reason why, and it may not be in every situation, but generally the reason why we suggest that it's his own department so that it reports to, the CEO equivalent, which would be the city manager in that case, is that there is no bias coming from a department. So if you report to another department, then that department may favor decisions in IT that help that department meet its mission, but then do not help other departments meet their mission. Because what ends up happening in some organizations is they become siloed. Like if you're in a local government, the library is their own little silo, and Parks and Rec is their own little silo, and maintenance is their own little silo, and finance is their own little silo. And they have all these little silos. And then IT is really supporting all of them. And all of them should have a vested interest in having a say at what happens in IT, because it supports all of their functions, usually, unless IT doesn't support some function somewhere. But generally, IT's everywhere, because there's end users everywhere, and almost everybody has computers. I mean, sometimes in Parks and Rec, you could say, well, they don't. But, even in Parks and Rec's type of thing, I've seen it where, the groundskeeper has an email account, right? So he's a part of it. Anyways, so to break away from that and having it report directly to a city manager to make sure that, because the city manager is in charge of all the different departments, and we want to make sure that IT is supporting all the different managements. So it kind of makes more sense to go that way. Now, the problem is what happens when you have, let's say, what would we have an exception? So if I wanted to say, where I would say, no, don't do the city manager. And that's if you have a city manager that's not interested in IT or not interested in supporting cybersecurity. Then you'd want to make sure that IT is reporting to somebody who's sufficiently at the C level who does support those things. Now, if you did report to, let's say, the CEO or city manager, in that as an example, and you had another department head that supports you, now that would also be a good thing as well. The more department heads that you can get on your side, and the way to get them on your side is to be customer service oriented, I guess, to all of them. What can I do to help you? Because that is what IT is doing, right? We're working for all the different departments within an organization. So generally, I'm recommending you go up to the highest part of the food chain that you can to report to, so that you make sure that you're meeting the needs of the entire organization. Now, if the situation that you're in is such that that's not an issue, then I wouldn't worry about changing it. Especially if you have an ally with you in where you're currently reporting to, then it's probably not a big issue. But again, there's general rules, and then there's like, our organization has got these issues. Well, how do you sidestep issues, right? Yeah, and it's true that in some organizations, sometimes you have to be the champion because so I've been in organizations myself, especially when I started here 20 years ago at Mays and Associates. I didn't think that I was getting fair representation. I kept on getting shuffled around as to who I had to report to, and I had a really hard time getting partners to buy in on IT security. They didn't want to spend any money on antivirus, right? Until we got a virus and it shut us down for a day. Then all of a sudden they wanted to hear what I had to say. Luckily for me, a couple incidents like that happened early on, and then since then, they have seen the value of IT security, and they always tell me about it. And the news is great for this too, because they hear about Target, and they hear about NSA spying on things, and they hear about all these bad cyber things, and they feel better now that they have they don't even call me the IT director, they call me the security director. Just in their minds, they're just thinking Don's the security guy, and he's the guy that's keeping us protected, which sometimes makes me not sleep at night. But that's a good thing that they eventually got to that. But it took a long time for me to get there, and it took a lot of work at it. And I had to build relationships with different departments. I had to yell at people in meetings. A lot of things have had to happen. And I've had to, apologize for things as well. So it's been a very interesting ride, but those are the types of things that you have to kind of do in situations like this. You have to be very proactive. If you're not generally a proactive person, it can be a very difficult process because you kind of have to go out and look for problems. You have to look for solutions, and you have to go to people and tell them, you have this problem, you don't even know you have this problem, but I've got a solution for you. And sometimes selling them on a problem they don't even know they have is kind of a hard deal. But anyways, things like that. So I understand that a lot of organizations, in fact, one of the federal government agencies and now in a small organization, it's really hard to figure out how the ITs, because IT and security are usually one function in the same. In large organizations, IT is going to be its own department. IT security is going to be its own department, and internal audit is going to be its own it's going to be its own department. And so you have 3 different departments working on things. And I have some clients that are large enough that have all of that, and they have a better process for that because they can deal with it. But they still have their own issues there too, and that is that everything takes forever because they have to go through 3 different departments for stuff to get done. And so there's good and bad points to it all. So I don't want to say that, it's all rosy on the other side of the hill, because it's not always rosy on the other side of the hill. But hopefully I answered the question, and you can always send me other questions offline. But does anyone else have any questions? Well, if not, then I'm waiting for a confirmation for the next session. It may be an introduction to Azure from a friend of mine in New Zealand, and he may be doing the next session. And it has nothing to do with the risk management framework. It's just another thing about Microsoft Azure. My next session for the risk management framework should be in probably 2 weeks from now. So not next week, but the week after that. But keep I don't have any events listed up there yet, but if you're on the list, we'll send out an email letting you know when the next one's coming. And you can always go to trainersunderground.com and look for updated stuff as well. So thank you all for attending.